All right. Good morning and welcome to STL History Live, Women of Beyond the Ballot, which is presented in conjunction with the museum's Beyond the Ballot exhibit, which is open now through June of 2022. My name is Aaron Pelker. I'm a community engagement coordinator with the Missouri History Museum's Public History Department, and I want to thank you for spending part of your Tuesday morning with us. Before we get to our presentation, I have a couple of brief remarks. I want to mention that both the Missouri History Museum in Forest Park and the Soldiers Memorial Military Museum in downtown St. Louis are both open to the public from Wednesday through Sunday. Your safety is a top priority, and we would love for you to visit if you feel comfortable doing so. Advanced free reservations are required to visit both locations, but please visit MoHistory, that's mohistory.org, to plan your visit and reserve your free tickets. Also, I want to mention that our Library and Research Center is now reopened for in-person appointments by reservation on Thursdays and Fridays. Again, I encourage you to check our website, mohistory.org, for further details. I'd also like to thank our museum members and the Zoom Museum Tax District for their generous support for both our exhibits and our programming. We wouldn't be able to host programs like this morning without their contributions, so thank you. And lastly, before I turn it over to our presenters for this morning's program, I do want to explain a few of the features you'll find on Zoom that may be helpful this morning. First, this will be about a 45-minute presentation with some time at the end for our presenter to answer a few questions. You can submit your questions for our speaker at any time through the Q&A feature on your Zoom toolbar. We're also happy to offer closed captioning through Zoom. To enable closed captioning, simply click the CC button on your Zoom toolbar. And finally, at the conclusion of the program, we hope you'll complete a short survey that will open automatically in your internet browser. We appreciate and look forward to your feedback. With that, I do want to introduce both Katie Moon, Exhibits Manager with the Missouri Historical Society, and Dan Fuller, Event and Volunteer Coordinator, at Bellefontaine Cemetery in Arboretum. Katie's going to introduce a short clip from the virtual tour of Beyond the Ballot before we get to Dan's lecture. So thank you, and take it away, Katie.
There I am. Sorry, slight technical difficulty. Good morning, everyone. As Aaron said, my name is Katie Moon. I'm the exhibits manager at the Missouri History Museum. And I also had the pleasure of being the curator and content developer of our current exhibit called Beyond the Ballot, St. Louis and Suffrage. And as part of that exhibit, worked with Bellefontaine Cemetery. Both they were sponsors of the exhibit, and just worked with them to gather more information. As many of you, like the rest of us, have not been out and about, and many of you probably haven't been to the exhibit, we've also developed a virtual tour of the exhibit with different stops, and thought it would be fun to show you one of those, specifically about Virginia Minor this morning, just to give you a little behind the scenes look of what information you'll find in the exhibit. And Virginia is also one of the women that is buried at Bellefontaine Cemetery. And if you've never been there, it is actually one of my favorite places in the city to go. It is beautiful this time of year. If you just want a quiet, peaceful place to go, but also want to learn some important history about St. Louis. But with that, I will switch it over to Aaron, who will play the video for you. And I'm sticking around if you have any specific questions about the exhibit or about Virginia Minor. I'm happy to answer those at the end. So thank you all for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
No history of the fight for women's rights and the long battle for suffrage in the United States would be complete without the story of Virginia Minor. In the years after the Civil War, Virginia took groundbreaking steps to assert her rights as an American citizen, and her decision to test the system took her all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Born in 1824, Virginia moved with her husband Francis, an attorney, to St. Louis in 1843. Both strong abolitionists, Francis worked for the Union Army during the Civil War, while Virginia volunteered with the Ladies' Union Aid Society. After the war, Virginia formed the first organization dedicated entirely to women's suffrage. The group met regularly at the Mercantile Library and hosted a national convention there in 1869. At the convention, attended by many leaders of the national suffrage movement, including Susan B. Anthony, the miners presented a radical new philosophy based on their interpretation of the 14th Amendment. They asserted that women, as citizens of the United States, already had the right to vote because voting was one of the rights guaranteed to citizens, that the right to vote was one of the marks of a citizen. The miners needed a test case to prove that their interpretation of the 14th Amendment was correct. On October 15, 1872, Virginia walked up the steps of the old courthouse and attempted to register to vote for the upcoming presidential election. Reese Happersett, the registrar of St. Louis's 6th Ward, refused her request. As a woman, Virginia wasn't allowed to bring her own case to court. Instead, her husband brought suit against Happersett. The case, which included several losses and subsequent appeals, made its way all the way to the Supreme Court. The court's final decision about the case could go two ways. They would either grant all women as citizens the right to vote, or would determine that citizenship alone didn't guarantee the right to vote. The entire country, especially the suffragists, waited impatiently for their decision. A full 2 years later, the court unanimously decided that voting was not one of the guaranteed rights of being a citizen. The suffrage movement was understandably demoralized, and it would take decades for the suffragists to regain their momentum and gather enough power and resources to begin their fight again. But the effects of the minor case went beyond the women's suffrage movement. After the Supreme Court determined that citizenship alone didn't guarantee voting rights, some states began adding their own voting requirements, such as knowing how to read and write or paying a poll tax. These new rules disproportionately affected African Americans, and it would take the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 for these restrictions to become illegal.
Sorry for that slight technical difficulty. But at this particular point, you should be seeing my original first slide. Ironically, I will be touching on Virginia Minor at the very end of my presentation. So I am going to go ahead and get started. I want to thank everybody for spending a little bit of their Tuesday morning with us. And I'll move along to explain that here at Bellefontaine Cemetery, we do like to celebrate the stories. We do have a little extra tagline in the fact that we do state that every stone tells a story. However, not every story has a stone. And whenever there is an individual without a marker, I will point that out. And there are some efforts to do some memorialization of people who have gone their entire time here at the cemetery without memorialization. First slide here is what I like to call the movement, and Katie did make mention of Susan B. Anthony, who's in the upper right-hand corner here. And it is ironic to me that so many of us who live in St. Louis know much about Susan B. Anthony, but yet we do not know anything about Virginia Minor or Edna Gellhorn, who you'll be experiencing both of those. This was not, as you will find out, just something that happened over a short period of time. This actually took generations of women to be able to secure the vote. And not every woman that we're going to talk about today is specific to the suffragist movement, but many and all of them have significant dealings and moving the rights of women forward. The first person, for example, is Susan Louise Marsh. And though she is associated with the suffragist movement, what she is really most known for is the Marsh Joint Guardianship Law. The way this story really begins is she was working in an orphanage when she had identified the fact that a young girl who was at the orphanage would see her weekly salary stripped from her by her father, and who would just basically drink that away. And she felt that this was not appropriate, of course. And so as a woman at this time, before being able to have the right to vote, she will have to petition other politicians and lawmakers to come up with the Marsh Joint Guardianship. And this is where I will look at my notes, because the full name of this law is Guardians and Curators of Minors Granting Married Women Equal Rights with Husbands in Care of Minor Children and the Management of Their Estates. Needless to say, quite a mouthful. But what it amounted to is, prior to the Marsh Joint Guardianship Law, women really didn't have a say in their children. Everything was done by the man. And this particular law, which will grab root here and then will grab root other states, will at least give women a fighting voice in their children's advocacy. And again, we take that so for granted today, but just imagine the time and place when that didn't exist. And we really do appreciate Susan's time and effort in that aspect. The next person that we're going to talk about is Florence Richardson. And she is a member of the St. Louis Equal Suffrage League. And what I really want to point out here about Florence is the fact that she is of a point in time where it does look like the right to vote is going to happen, but there is a concern that women who have never had the right to vote before are a little bit uneducated from that standpoint. And maybe that they will just vote for whatever their husbands tell them to, and not the particular needs and necessities they have. And so, along with other women, this St. Louis Equal Suffragist League will take place and will really give women a platform to get to know what it means to vote and how they can work back and forth. Now, Florence is an example of somebody who, and we'll run into this on a couple of the women, have other marks in the city of St. Louis, and many of us are very appreciative of our St. Louis Symphony, and Florence was a very important aspect in that. Another little quirky side note, and you'll see on my screen now that you see the image of Ernest Hemingway pop up in the corner. Ernest Hemingway was married 4 times. He married St. Louis women quite frequently, and 2 of his mother-in-laws happen to be buried with us. Florence Richardson would be one of those 2. We'll get to the other one in just a little bit. Now, a woman who really did not have much to do with the suffragist movement would be Florence Hayward, but she was so instrumental in so many other things. And as I like to tell people who come out on tour, Florence was a person who was too busy to say no. She was kind of a juggernaut of her time. She came to St. Louis at a very pivotal point and will be very influential in the 1904 World's Fair, also known as the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. The photograph you see down in the bottom right-hand corner, and you'll see that Florence is the only woman standing there with all the rest of the men. On the far left-hand side is going to be our mayor, Rella Wells. Next to Florence and on our right would be David R. Francis. And then a fairly young Cardinal Glennon stands next to David R. Francis. And the reason for the photograph is the fact that Florence was able to secure from England the Queen's Jubilee presents. And this is something that nobody would have ever thought would leave the country of the United Kingdom, and it has never left since then. She was able to secure those as well as treasures from the Vatican. And she did that all on her own accord and with no help from anyone else. Now, the sad part of this story was the fact that when David R. Francis did write his book concerning all of the elements of the World's Fair and what it took to put together, he really glossed over and really didn't mention it any kind of depth what Florence was able to achieve. Anna Clamp is the only president of the St. Louis Union Aid Society. She was very instrumental in that point in time. This is where she will also meet the aforementioned Virginia Minor. And what will happen is many of these women who are associated with the St. Louis Union Aid Society, an organization that came into being because of the elements of the Civil War, they will make these connections and they will find for the first time a place in society. And what you'll see is the St. Louis Union Aid Society becomes a little bit of a catalyst for the things that will come later, such as the League of Women Voters and much of what Katie was talking about with Virginia Minor. Again, one of the exciting things about so many of these women is the fact that they didn't just stop with this one thing that we're talking about as far as the right to vote. They will be a part of many other aspects. The St. Louis Union Aid Society for Anna Clamp, the Western Sanitary Commission. She is also very instrumental in the Western Female Guardian Home and the St. Louis Protestant Orphan Asylum. So these are women who are very interested in society, making society a better place and making sure that it is inclusive of all. And I think they were very aware of that because of their place as women at that point in time and having so little, if no voice at all. Now, it was always a pleasure and is always a pleasure to work with Katie, and Katie came out and did a special little clip for us on July Collins, and I got the definite feeling that this was somebody who really struck a chord with Katie. And this is one of those other stories where, yes, this woman is a part of the suffrage movement, but she is known for some other things. And independently and pretty much on her own is the founding of the Night and Day Camp here in St. Louis. She, as others, had perceived that there was a disparity, especially for working women and for poor working women specifically. And there was an abundance of tuberculosis. And so the Night and Day Camp became a way of treatment for these women who were suffering from this affliction. And it actually had a very positive impact. Many of the women, better than 50% of the women, would see an improvement in their health and be able to go back to work. And again, July was at the epicenter of this. She basically was able to secure the money, the grounds, all of this, and was able to make a very big social impact. As we go into World War I, she is at the Union Station Canteen, which is going to be where all those servicemen are going back and forth. And as you can see on my slide, it was considered one of the greatest canteens in the United States. At one point in time, July had something like 500 volunteers working underneath her to make that canteen what it was and the greatest one ever. Now, in two situations, what you're going to see here at the cemetery, and it is a very big platform for us to be able to talk about this, and that is the intergenerational aspect of securing the right to vote for women. And so we have on the left-hand side a daughter and on the right-hand side, a mother, who in their own independent ways will have an effect. And then, of course, together are a part of this movement. I'm going to start with Adeline, who is of the Civil War and was of the St. Louis Human Aid Society, but she was much more than that. She was skilled in her abilities to be that of an assistant to one Dr. Pope, who asked her to move with him as the troops began to move out of St. Louis and move south for the siege at Vicksburg. And it's during this time that Adeline is actually wounded on 2 different occasions. She is, along with another woman, tending fallen soldiers, and she will secure frostbite. Now, she is able to recover from this particular injury. About a little bit less than a year later, she is actually struck by a mini ball in the knee while she is, again, tending those that she is trying to give aid to. Now, ironically, later on, as these men are receiving pensions from the afflictions they received from the Civil War, Adeline has not received those. And so there becomes a great debate about how this can go about. Technically, again, Adeline is not a military man who enlisted, but is a volunteer. And so on October 1st, 1888, there is a bill that goes through Congress that will secure for Adeline a $30 a month pension. And this is one of the first women to receive such a pension. And when you look at her marker, that is a military marker. And as you know, a person who goes to a number of cemeteries, interestingly enough, I will tell you that finding a woman with a Civil War era military marker is rather unusual. And so this is the tone that Adeline will set for her daughter. Phoebe Couzens will be a multifaceted individual, and in some ways, a little bit of a person who will flip-flop just a little bit. Her father was a United States Marshal, and upon his death, Phoebe will become the first woman to be a United States Marshal. She is one of the first women to receive a law degree and actually practice law. And she is associated with the suffragist movement. Though later in life, you will see a little bit of a flip-flop on her, as she saw many of those that were in the suffragist movement start to take up with what is known as the drives during the Prohibition run-up. And that was something that Phoebe will definitely flip-flop on. I cannot express enough that if you have not been to the Missouri History Museum to see the presentation and exhibit of Beyond the Ballot, definitely do so. And one of the call-outs that I want to make is how they did handle Phoebe, who is, as you kind of round that first corner, you'll see a display and exhibit that goes into much more depth about Phoebe and how she went from being somebody who was so entwined with the movement to being somebody who was a little bit more on the outside. The other thing I do want to point out is the marker that you're seeing. When Phoebe died in 1913, she actually was unmarked. And the marker that you see was done some years later, and that was actually done by those associated with Washington University and the School of Law. As a woman to receive a very early law degree, it was felt that there needed to be recognition of that, and that marker was put in place. I'm going to tell you, for some of you, maybe what could be a new term, and that's cenotaph that you see there at the top of the screen. What cenotaph is, by definition, is an empty tomb. So there is memorialization of Mary Meacham, but there are no human remains. In fact, at this particular point, her final place of rest is somewhat of a mystery, though we do have researchers who are working on that, and I'm happy to report that it looks like we are making some progress on that effort. The Mary Meacham Freedom Crossing is the first in the National Park System to be a designated part of the Underground Railroad. This is actually a husband and wife team in the form of Mary Meacham and John Barry Meacham, but of course we're focused on Mary in this particular presentation. And after her husband's death in 1854, Mary Meacham, of course, becomes the center aspect. Now, as there was the St. Louis Union Aid Society, independently and separate, there was the Colored Ladies Soldiers Aid Society during this time, of which Mary Meacham was an important aspect of. And, they were intentionally helping men of color who had been wounded in the hospital. So there was a true segregation from that particular standpoint. The other thing to mention about Mary Meacham is she was, along with her husband initially and then on her own, somebody who was securing former enslaved individuals their freedom and navigating them from a slave state of Missouri to the free state of Illinois. And in a particular case that took place, she was captured and tried by jury. Now, we do know that in 1865, she was able to secure her freedom. And from 1865 to 1869, the whereabouts and the happenings of Mary Meacham are a little bit of a mystery, and that's what those researchers are working on right now. The hope is that at some point in time, we can give a much more clear and concise and complete understanding of all of Mary Meacham's activities right up until her death in 1869. Susan Blow is actually one of those names that is very well known in the St. Louis area, and most everybody does know of her component in creating and helping to create the public kindergarten system. So what I do like to do is maybe tell a little bit more about some of the things that people do not know. Susan Blow was the daughter of Henry Taylor Blow, who under U.S. grant will become ambassador to Brazil. For the 15 months, basically, that he was ambassador to Brazil, Susan Elizabeth Blow would come forward and teach herself Portuguese so that she could be a translator for her father. And in that aspect, she was able to help ease trade communication between Brazil and the United States. Now, Susan Elizabeth Blow, of course, will go on to work with a man named Froebel, who believed in the concept of play equals learning, the German word kindergarten, and was able to secure the very first kindergarten in what was initially the Carondelet school system, which will be absorbed by the St. Louis school system. If you ever venture south of the city of St. Louis into Lee, you can see a representation of the first kindergarten there, and there is quite an interesting dialogue concerning Susan Elizabeth Blow and her endeavors in the education of children. Interestingly enough, it was somewhat of an uphill battle. We, again, in this day and age, take kindergarten so for granted, but that was not the case in this time period. And so it was an uphill battle. And what you will find is Susan Elizabeth Blow will donate her time and money and resources to be able to put those kindergartens in place. And it's after showing and demonstrating how important they are in that leg up in education that finally the kindergarten system really takes hold and starts to take across the United States. And again, as I said, we take it so for granted today. Another family who is very associated with the suffragist movement and across actually 3 generations is going to be the Allen family. So we're going to start with, and again, kind of bear with me as you see these labels, but this is going to be the mother and grandmother. So this is Penelope Pope Allen, who has a place in history as the sister of General Pope of Civil War fame. She is in a part of a very progressive family who does see that women should have more of a voice. And so in 1867, just at the close of the Civil War, Penelope Pope Allen, along with people that you've already heard about in the form of Virginia Minor, will help to secure campaigning for votes for women in the Women's Suffrage Association of Missouri. And she did co-found that with Virginia Minor. Now, again, in looking back at history, we have a tendency of thinking that things happen very quickly and somewhat overnight, but that is not the case. So we have a mother who begins this fight in 1867, and she hands off the baton to her daughter, Penelope Allen Orrick. And Penelope Allen Orrick will again pick up where her mother leaves off. And if you're kind of keeping up with what I'm posting, you'll see that she does pass in 1915, which is before women do receive the vote in the 1920 amendment. And so she is kind of the in-between baton holder who is carrying this forward and making this struggle. And so yet a second generation will pass and not actually secure the right to vote. Now we go to the daughter and granddaughter in the form of Christine Orrick Fordyce. And in 1917, she is in the Missouri legislature when she will make this statement. She says, 50 years ago, my grandmother came before you asking for the enfranchisement of women. 25 years ago, my mother came to make the same request. Tonight, I am asking for the ballot. Are you going to make it necessary for my daughter to appear in her turn? It must have had somewhat of an effect because the Missouri legislature will vote to give women the right to vote. However, in a very bittersweet irony, you'll notice that Christine Fordyce did not see the right to vote in the fact that she died in 1919 before women will receive the right to vote. All right, so this is a person I've been kind of hinting back and forth about. I made mention of her at the very beginning of the presentation. She is, as I like to say, the person who was there she's the right person at the right time and did the right thing. So fairly simple marker up there on the left, and I will explain what you're seeing down there below is a contemporary version of what's known as the Walkless Talkless Parade, and something that Edna Gellhorn was so instrumental. The 1916 National Democratic Convention was to be held in St. Louis, and Edna Gellhorn, along with many other women in the city of St. Louis who had not received the right to vote, saw this as an opportunity. And they needed an impactful way to represent themselves. And so better than 7,000 women will dress in white, wear yellow sashes with yellow parasols. And they will line the streets between the convention hall where the delegates will meet and the hotels where they were resting. And at the appropriate time, in unison, the 7,000 women would basically turn their back to those delegates. And in a way, voicing the fact that they had no voice in government and that they would be a force to be reckoned with. The Walkless Talkless Parade is a very important component visually of women trying to secure the right to vote. Another aspect is what's known as the tableau, and you're going to see an image of that a little bit later. Whenever you have a complicated process like securing the right to vote, I think it's really important to break things down into an element, and that is what the women were doing at that point in time. This is not a sweeping thing that happens overnight. Women do not, again, wake up one morning and the right to vote is there. This will start to spread across the nation, state by state. Some states voting, some states not voting. And so the tableau was a way to visually depict how states stood at that point in time. And so it was a way for people to visually check and see how was the movement going. I'll finish that conversation in just a little bit, but it's appropriate for me now to push in and bring our friend Ernest Hemingway in here. Martha Gellhorn is the daughter of Edna Gellhorn and is again one of the four wives of Ernest Hemingway. So interestingly enough, and just a strange little side aspect of the cemetery, we do have two of the mother-in-laws of Ernest Hemingway buried at the Bellefontaine Cemetery. Now, Katie did a wonderful job of telling you about Virginia Minor and what she was able to do. In my own interpretation, I definitely will kind of build on what Katie said and say that she was, along with her husband, kind of the flashpoint that will really get the movement going. Here in St. Louis, a lot of people do not realize one of the very first suffragist organizations that started, Virginia Minor is a part of it. But the part that I want to expand upon, because it is so connected to the cemetery, is the fact that during this whole process, Virginia Minor is very much ostracized from community, from society, and especially from the clergy in the city of St. Louis. On the day that Virginia Minor was buried at Bellefontaine Cemetery, she had priorly arranged that no person of the cloth would be represented or speaking at her gravesite. And the reason was that the clergy had really thrown Virginia Minor under the bus. They had identified her as a rebel rouser, disrupting the natural order of things, overturning the home life of, or the sanctity of the home life here in the United States. And though many women, of course, sided with Virginia Minor, they were afraid to be associated and therefore also ostracized. So on the day that Virginia Minor was buried at the cemetery, there were only 7 people in attendance to her service. And it's only been in very recent times that her recognition has really come to play. So in December of 2013, so just within the last 8 years, Virginia Minor did receive a bust in the Hall of Famous Missourians in our capital in Jefferson City. So from 1894 basically till 2013, there was really no public recognition of Virginia Minor and her efforts in a tangible thing. And that tangible thing, of course, being her bust that people could see and talk about, and maybe ask the questions of why is she a famous St. Louis or a famous Missourian. And so I think it's very important to kind of to highlight and underscore that. The other thing I do want to recognize is the fact that each time we do now have an election, there is a small set of people who come to the cemetery and place their I voted stickers at the grave of Virginia Minor. Susan B. Anthony up in New York will receive thousands of I voted stickers. And my hope is that as time goes and as more and more people are educated on the impact that Virginia Minor had in the beginning elements of the suffragist movement, that more and more will come and pay their respects, especially at the point in time of voting. Now, in that interesting little twist of fate, and something else that Katie mentioned, she mentioned the name Reese Happersett, who happened to be the county clerk who turned down Virginia on her initial petition to have a ballot to vote. And he is too also buried at Bellefontaine Cemetery. Now he is in a landmass that's just down and across from where Virginia Minor is buried. And I will say, in a kind of twist of fate and an irony, Reese Happersett has no marker. And so there is no point in place for people to recognize what he did or did not do in that point in time that Virginia was looking for a ballot. All right, I am going to wind down, and with winding down, I do want to point out that, and I know Katie will affirm this, that there were many other women who had every right to be a part of Beyond the Ballot, and we too at the cemetery have many others too. So I want to at least give their names. And on the left-hand side, you have Edith Beringer. Below her is Rebecca Hazard, who I'm going to mention here at the very close. In the center is Thecla Bernays. Amelia Hooch is up on the upper right-hand side, and Elizabeth Ingalls is there on the right, on the bottom. And so these are 5 additional women who were significant in securing the right to vote for women in their own way. Rebecca Hazard gets a special note that in 1912, she actually wrote a song that became kind of a banner for women trying to secure the right to vote. And that is what you're looking at right now. And though she died before the 1916 Democratic Convention, her words are at least being sung aloud by those women wearing white with the yellow sashes and the yellow parasols. And so if you just take a little look down through those words, I think it is a very impactful song. And in fact, whenever I do tours concerning some of the notable women at Bellefontaine Cemetery. I'll bring these words along and see if I can get the group to sing. Bringing things into more contemporary times, these are images, of course, in the contemporary time with reenactors portraying women during the struggle for the right to vote. And up in the upper right-hand corner is the depiction of the tableau I was trying to explain before. So what you have are the women in white with the shields and the states that have passed a ratification for women receiving the right to vote. The grays on the right-hand side will be states that have not voted as of yet and are basically neutral. Those, of course, on the left, wearing black and basically in mourning, are states that voted against. And so, again, this was a visual representation for women. And of course, each time the tableau would be put in place, there could be a change to the women and the colors and the shields, of course, raising up until, of course, in 1920, women did secure the right to vote. Moving forward, we have quite a bit of things going on at the cemetery. Right at the beginning of COVID, we were able to put in place our new tour line, and that's what you're seeing. Whenever you see an arrow, that is prompting you to one of the people that we have highlighted. And I will point out that Virginia Minor is an example of somebody who is highlighted on our tour line. Our Angels Rest is our second rendition and a appropriate way for us, the cemetery, to give back to our community, which is North St. Louis. The cemetery, through its friends organizations, is a free grave and marker to parents who have lost a child under the age of 2. And what you're seeing there is our main office, which has been closed to the public during COVID. We have plans of reopening that in the future. But just to the right of that door is a lending library box where you can secure a self-guided tour booklet that'll take you along the path. And then our last little demarcation here is, again, Bellefontaine Cemetery for yesterday, today, and forever. The cemetery will be a cultural aspect of the city of St. Louis forever and always. And programs like this through the Missouri History Museum are very key and important as we remember those lives that have been entrusted to us. Real quick call out for those that I was able to secure images from. And then the last thing that I've learned to do on Zoom is to put up my email. If there's any questions that we're not able to answer, or if you don't feel comfortable in asking a question, I definitely suggest you take a real quick snapshot of this and get back to me whenever you feel comfortable. At this particular point, I'm going to stop my share, and I think Aaron will come in and maybe see if there's any questions out there.
And I'm not seeing any questions right now. I'm just going to throw up this slide. Let's see. No, there's no questions as of now. So, Dan, I'm going to say that, you know, folks, if they think of a question, to go ahead and email that to Dan. He's very nice and friendly and prompt with responses, so he can always answer any questions that you may have. But I am not seeing any. I don't know if you guys have any last comments you want to make, but if not, I can kind of wrap this up and I'll stop if I see any questions. But I do want to thank both Dan Fuller and Katie Moon for joining us this morning. We have our regularly scheduled STL History Live programs on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. and Thursdays at 6:30 p.m., as well as Soldiers Memorial Chow and Chats on select Wednesdays at noon. You can see a couple of the upcoming programs on this slide on your screen, and you can find links for all our upcoming programs at MoHistory, that's mohistory.org, or on the Missouri History Museum Facebook page. So please be sure to check out that lineup. And I also would like to remind you to not forget to fill out that survey and let us know what you thought about our program today. So thanks again to you for joining us, and we will see you next time. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Katie.